War of attrition? I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. Is Vladimir Putin correct to believe that the West will lose its resolve with regard to the war in Ukraine? This week, the Washington Post reported that a well-connected Russian billionaire said Putin didn't expect the West's strong, unified response to the conflict, but now he's trying to reshape the situation, and he believes that in the longer term, he will win, adding that Putin is a very patient guy. He can afford to wait 6 to 9 months. He controls Russian society much more tightly than the West can control its society. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has estimated that he needs $7 billion in aid a month just to keep the country running. This news coming on the heels of a Politico report that says concerns are mounting on Capitol Hill about the administration's ability to properly account for all the money and weapons heading to Ukraine. It's coming under increased scrutiny from members of both parties, from progressive Elizabeth Warren to libertarian Rand Paul. Some lawmakers warning the administration that a future aid package for Ukraine could lose the overwhelming support past efforts have had if the Pentagon doesn't step up its oversight on previously allocated funds. And with no ceasefire or peace agreement in sight, the fight between Ukrainian and Russian forces slogs on. Zelensky this week told lawmakers in Luxembourg that nearly 12 million people have been internally displaced since the Russian invasion started. He also conceded that Russian forces are advancing in the eastern part of Ukraine and now control a greater amount of territory than they did before the war started.
As of now, nearly 20% of our territory is under the control of occupiers, almost 125,000 square kilometers.
It's a blunt acknowledgement of the slow but substantial gains the Kremlin has made since the war began. This is how NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg described the current state of the conflict after meeting with President Biden this week.
Wars are by nature unpredictable, and therefore we just have to be prepared for the long haul, because what we see is that this war has now become a war of attrition, where the Ukrainians are paying a high price for defending their own country.
But the delivery of $700 million worth of new sophisticated weaponry by the U.S., which would have been unthinkable in the war's earliest days, could change the dynamics on the battlefield. This week in the New York Times, President Biden penned an essay explaining that, quote, "We will provide Ukrainians with more advanced rocket systems and munitions that will enable them to more precisely strike key targets on the battlefield in Ukraine." Further along, the president attempted to dispel any fears of a nuclear conflict breaking out, calling Russia's rhetoric throughout the conflict dangerous and extremely irresponsible. Quote, "Let me be clear. Any use of nuclear weapons in this conflict on any scale would be completely unacceptable to us as well as the rest of the world and would entail severe consequences." With me now to discuss is Admiral James Stavridis. He spent more than 30 years in the Navy, rising to become the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. He's also the author of the brand new book, To Risk It All: 9 Conflicts and the Crucible of Decision. Admiral, is time on Vladimir Putin's side?
I don't think so, Michael. And, you know, we ought to begin by saying Putin has been the master of miscalculation since this thing began. He underestimated Volodymyr Zelensky. He thought he was a former comedian. Turns out the guy is like Winston Churchill. He underestimated the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people. Putin told his troops, "You'll be greeted with bottles of vodka when you invade." Well, they were greeted with bottles of flammable liquid called Molotov cocktails. He underestimated the will and the capability of the West to hang together and put, I think, very serious sanctions on him. So point one, Putin is the miscalculator here. And point two is, before we decide that Putin is really succeeding here, let's put that in perspective. And you know this, Michael. His objective was to conquer the entire country, to take 100% of it. He's taken an additional 5%. In other words, he was in control of 15% of the country before this thing started. He's now in control of about 20%. I'd say, even giving him the benefit of the doubt of, okay, he now controls 20% of the country on an objective of 100%, that's a failing grade. Having said all that, sure, we ought to worry about the will and the ability of the West to hang together over time. And some would say, oh, look at Afghanistan. We folded our cards. We hung in there for 20 years. And oh, by the way, we didn't fold in World War I. We didn't fold in World War II. We didn't fold in Colombia. We didn't fold in the Balkans. I wouldn't bet against the West holding together. So bottom line, no, I don't think time is on Vladimir Putin's side.
Okay, so I agree with everything you've said. It's accurate up until now. Some of the conflicts that you identified were not conflicts where we were direct participants, like the Balkans. But you know we're fickle, and we have midterms coming, and people are paying at the pump. And while Americans are supportive of Ukraine, I've seen polling data, you've seen polling data, that what matters more to voters is inflation. And then throw in the food situation. I'm going to read to you something. It comes from the head of the Russian Security Council, so maybe you'll take it with a grain of salt. His name is Gazeta. He says, pardon me, his name is Patrushev. You probably are aware of him. The world is gradually falling into an unprecedented food crisis. Tens of millions of people in Africa or in the Middle East will turn out to be on the brink of starvation because of the West. In order to survive, they will flee to Europe. I'm not sure Europe will survive the crisis. The combination of gas prices at home, a food crisis overseas, might that put time on the side of Putin?
Certainly, it is worth worrying about and addressing. And so let's take energy first. Critical that the West begin the process of the great rewiring, which is what I would call what needs to happen to the energy systems and delivery around the world. And it's everything from gas in Europe to fuel in sub-Saharan Africa. That's happening, Michael, and it's happening by market forces, frankly. So that's going to create some discontinuities, and there'll be continued upward pressure on energy prices. And yes, it's a concern, but that can be addressed over time, and I think it will be reasonably well. On food, I think this is a looming tower. I agree in the sense of the Russians' comment that there could be a global food crisis, and there is a solution to that. And by the way, that would be opening up the grain of Ukraine, which is bottled up in Ukraine right now, and considering creating humanitarian maritime operations, escorting grain tankers in, the grain comes out. You do it through international waters, Ukrainian waters. Is it confrontational? Maybe. Does it create some risk? Sure. But that would be a way to approach solving that end of the problem. Again, bottom line, yes, there will be discontinuities. I, for one, do not see the West simply cracking in the face of Russian claims of difficulties ahead.